Poor girl gives her sandwich to a poorly dressed millionaire. The next day, the police call at her door. In the bustling morning of New York City, Sarah Thompson hurried along the cobblestone streets of Greenwich Village, precariously balancing a tray of homemade sandwiches. At 23, she was the epitome of perseverance, with her impeccably clean apron and a smile that defied the hardships of her daily life. The small sandwich stand she shared with her mother, Mrs. Grace Thompson, was more than just a business. It was the legacy of 3 generations of strong women. This morning, however, something in the air hinted at a change in her usual routine. "Sarah," called Mr. Johnson from his flower shop, "did you save me my special club sandwich?" "Of course, Mr. Johnson, and I added extra bacon, just how you like it," Sarah replied, pausing her hurried pace. As she delivered the order, her eyes fell upon a man sitting on one of the park benches. He stood out completely from the picturesque neighborhood atmosphere. His suit, though clearly expensive, was wrinkled and dirty, and his lost gaze reflected deep sadness. Sarah couldn't help but remember the words her grandmother Rose used to repeat like a mantra. "Kindness is the language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see." Without thinking twice, she took one of her best sandwiches and approached the stranger. "Excuse me, sir, would you like a sandwich? They're freshly made," she offered in a soft voice. The man looked up, revealing green eyes that, despite their evident weariness, retained a glimmer of dignity. "No, I don't have any money to pay," he responded with an accent that betrayed his privileged education. "It's a gift," Sarah insisted, leaving the sandwich beside him. Sometimes we all need a little kindness. What Sarah couldn't imagine was that this simple act of generosity was about to trigger a series of events that would change not only her life, but that of her entire family. Because that man wasn't just any vagrant. He was Alexander Blackwell, the missing heir to the most important hotel empire in America. In her mansion on the Upper East Side, Victoria Blackwell, the family matriarch, had been desperately searching for her son for 6 months, who had disappeared after discovering a devastating truth about his father. What no one knew was that Alexander had chosen to live on the streets, trying to find answers and perhaps redemption. As Sarah returned to her stand, Alexander slowly unwrapped the sandwich, and for the first time in months a tear rolled down his cheek. It wasn't because of hunger, but because of the simple and pure kindness he had just witnessed, so different from the world of deceit and appearances he came from. At the stand, Mrs. Grace Thompson watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew well that generous heart that beat in Sarah's chest, the same one she had inherited from her grandmother Rose. But she also knew that in this world, sometimes kindness has unexpected consequences. "Why did you give a free sandwich to that man?" asked Grace, while preparing more bread for the afternoon. "I don't know, Mom. There's something in his eyes." "It reminded me of Grandma's stories about Dad when he left," Sarah replied, unaware that her words held a deeper truth than she could imagine. The sun began to warm the streets of Greenwich Village, and with it, a story that would intertwine seemingly disparate destinies was set in motion. As Alexander savored each bite of the sandwich, his mind began to awaken from a long slumber, and a decision started to form in his heart. What neither of them knew was that this simple act of kindness was about to uncover long-buried family secrets, reveal unsuspected connections, and trigger a love story that would defy all social conventions. The next morning dawned wrapped in a soft drizzle that soaked the streets of Greenwich Village. Sarah, under the awning of her stand, watched the raindrops fall while her mind wandered to the mysterious man from the day before. She couldn't explain why, but there was something in his gaze that seemed strangely familiar. "Sarah, the sandwiches are getting cold," her mother's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Girl, you've been in the clouds since yesterday. What's wrong with you?" "Nothing, Mom. It's just that—" Sarah trailed off as she saw a familiar figure approaching through the rain. It was him, the man in the wrinkled suit, but this time he looked different. He had cleaned up, and although his clothes were still the same, he had regained some of his distinguished bearing. "Good morning," Alexander greeted, with a voice that denoted years of refined education. I wanted to thank you for your kindness yesterday, Miss..." "Sarah," she replied, feeling an inexplicable nervousness. "Sarah Thompson." The surname Thompson caused a flash of recognition in Alexander's eyes, but he quickly concealed it. "Alexander," he introduced himself simply, omitting his last name. Mrs. Grace Thompson observed the scene with a mixture of curiosity and concern. There was something about this man that reminded her of someone from her past, but she couldn't pinpoint who. "Would you like some breakfast?" Sarah offered, but this time Alexander took out a bill from his pocket. "Today I've come to pay," he responded with a faint smile. "And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you some questions about this neighborhood. I'm looking for something." As Sarah served the sandwiches in the Blackwell mansion, Victoria received a call that made her turn pale. "Are you sure?" "You've seen him in Greenwich Village." Her hands trembled as she hung up the phone. After months of searching, they finally had a lead on her son's whereabouts. Back at the stand, Alexander and Sarah were conversing. He listened attentively as she told him about the history of the neighborhood, family traditions, and how her grandmother Rose had started the sandwich business. "And your father?" Alexander asked with an interest that went beyond simple curiosity. "He left when I was very young," Sarah replied, noticing how Alexander's expression became more serious. "My grandmother used to say he had his reasons, but I never knew what they were." Alexander nodded thoughtfully as a distant memory began to take shape in his mind. The name Thompson, Greenwich Village, a story of abandonment. The pieces of a puzzle were starting to fit together. "You know, my grandmother always said there are no coincidences," Sarah continued, "that every encounter has a purpose." "Maybe your grandmother was right," Alexander replied, staring intently at his coffee cup. "There are secrets that have been buried for too long in this city." At that moment, an elegantly dressed woman passed in front of the stand, briefly stopping to look at Alexander. He visibly tensed, but the woman continued on her way, disappearing into the crowd. "Do you know her?" Sarah asked, noticing his reaction. "She's part of a life I left behind," he replied enigmatically. "A life full of lies and appearances." Mrs. Grace Thompson, who had been observing the scene, felt a chill run down her spine. Alexander's way of speaking, his gestures, everything reminded her of someone from her past, someone she had promised never to mention. "Sarah," she called to her daughter, "it's time to prepare more bread for the afternoon." Alexander stood up, leaving a bill that covered several times the cost of his breakfast. "I'd like to come back tomorrow, if you'll allow me," he said, looking specifically at Mrs. Thompson as if seeking her approval. "The doors of our stand are always open to people with good hearts," she replied, carefully studying his face. As Alexander walked away under the rain that was starting to intensify, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more significant than it seemed. What she didn't know was that in her purse, carefully guarded, Mrs. Thompson had an old photograph that could explain many things, a photograph she hadn't seen in more than 20 years. In the dimness of her room, Mrs. Thompson took an old shoebox from the bottom of her closet. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing a pile of yellowed photographs and letters tied with a faded ribbon. Among them, she found the one she was looking for, an image from her youth where she appeared next to an elegant man in the gardens of a mansion. "Richard Blackwell," she whispered, caressing the photograph. The man in the image bore a striking resemblance to Alexander, the mysterious visitor from that morning. It couldn't be a coincidence. Meanwhile, in the Greenwich Village market, Sarah was organizing the stand for the next day, humming an old song her grandmother Rose had taught her. Suddenly, an elegant voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, miss. Is this the Thompson family sandwich stand?" Sarah turned to find an older woman impeccably dressed. It was the same woman who had passed in front of the stand that morning, the one who had provoked a reaction in Alexander. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Sarah Thompson. How can I help you?" Victoria Blackwell studied the young woman's face intently, as if looking for something familiar in her features. "I've been told that a man has been seen here, tall, green-eyed, wearing a worn suit." Sarah hesitated before responding. Something in her instinct told her she should be cautious. "Many people pass through here, ma'am." "I'm Victoria Blackwell," the woman introduced herself, observing Sarah's reaction to the surname. "And the man I'm looking for is my son, Alexander." At that moment, Mrs. Grace Thompson appeared at the stand, dropping her purse when she saw Victoria. The two women looked at each other, instantly recognizing each other despite the years that had passed. "Grace, it's been so long," Victoria murmured, with a mixture of emotions in her voice. 23 years to be exact," Grace replied, regaining her composure. Since that night when your husband Richard forced me to leave the mansion." Sarah observed the scene without understanding, as the pieces of a puzzle she didn't know existed began to move in her mind. "Mum, do you know Mrs. Blackwell?" "More than I'd like to, daughter," Grace replied without taking her eyes off Victoria. "She was the wife of the man who destroyed our lives." Victoria paled at Grace's words. "Things weren't as you think, Grace. There's so much you don't know." "What do I need to know?" Grace interrupted. "That Richard threw me out of the mansion when he found out I was pregnant? That he threatened to destroy my family if I ever revealed the truth?" Sarah felt the world come to a stop. "Mom, what are they talking about?" At that moment, Alexander appeared at the corner of the market, stopping abruptly when he saw the scene in front of the sandwich stand. Victoria turned to him, tears in her eyes. "Alexander, son." But Alexander wasn't looking at his mother. His eyes were fixed on Grace and then on Sarah, as a terrible realization began to dawn on his face. "That's why you seem so familiar to me," he whispered, approaching Sarah. "You have the same eyes as my father, our father." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Grace Thompson leaned on the counter, while Victoria took out a handkerchief to dry her tears. Sarah looked alternately at her mother and Alexander, trying to process the revelation she had just heard. "Are we siblings?" she asked with a trembling voice. "That's why you ran away from home, isn't it?" Victoria asked her son. "You found the documents in your father's office?" Alexander nodded slowly. "I found the letters Grace wrote to him, the evidence of monthly payments to keep her silent. All this time I had a sister and never knew it." The bustle of the market continued around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the small sandwich stand. The truth, kept for more than 2 decades, finally came to light, threatening to change forever the lives of all those present. The evening fell over Greenwich Village as the family tried to process the revelations of that afternoon. They had closed the stand early and were now in the modest living room of the Thompsons' apartment, where the air felt heavy with the newly revealed truths. "I need you to explain everything to me," Sarah demanded, her voice mixed with determination and vulnerability. "From the beginning." Grace took a deep breath, seated in her old floral armchair, while Victoria remained standing by the window as if seeking an escape. Alexander had settled in a chair at a distance, observing the family photographs that decorated the walls. "I worked as a housekeeper in the Blackwell mansion for 5 years, Grace began, her hands clasped in her lap. "Your father, Richard, was different then. He wasn't the cold man he became later." "Richard and I had an arranged marriage," Victoria interrupted, without turning around. "We married for convenience, to unite our family's fortunes. He never really loved me." "We fell in love," Grace continued, looking directly at her daughter. "Richard promised me he would leave Victoria, that we would start a new life together. But when he found out I was pregnant—" "My father was always a coward," Alexander spat, rising from his chair. "He preferred to keep up appearances rather than face the truth. He threw you out of the mansion and bought your silence, didn't he?" Grace nodded, as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. "He threatened to destroy my family if I spoke. He gave me money and ordered me to disappear. I was only 19 and scared." "And you knew?" Sarah asked Victoria, her voice trembling with emotion. "I suspected," Victoria admitted, finally turning to face the family. "But Richard convinced me that Grace had tried to blackmail us, that the money was to keep her quiet about a lie. I preferred to believe him. Until I found the letters," Alexander interjected. "Letters that Grace wrote to him for years, telling him about Sarah, about her life. He kept them all, but never responded to any." Sarah abruptly stood up, walking towards the small shelf where a photograph of her grandmother Rose rested. "Grandma, did she know?" "Your grandmother was my salvation," Grace replied with a sad smile. "She took me in when I had no one else, taught me the sandwich business, helped me get ahead. She always said that truth has its own time to come to light." "And now here we are," Alexander murmured, approaching Sarah. "Siblings who didn't know of each other's existence, united by the kindness of a sandwich." A nervous laugh escaped Sarah's lips, mixing with her tears. "Grandma also used to say that food has the power to bring people together." "There's something else you should know," Victoria interrupted, taking an envelope from her purse. "Richard, your father, is very ill. The doctors say he doesn't have much time left." Silence fell over the room once again. Grace slowly got up, approaching her daughter. "Richard wants to see you both," Victoria continued. "After Alexander disappeared, something changed in him. He started talking about regret, about second chances." "And now what?" Sarah asked, looking alternately at her mother and her newly discovered brother. "What are we supposed to do with all this?" Alexander took his sister's hand, surprising her with the gesture. "We don't have to do anything we don't want to. But maybe this is the opportunity to heal old wounds." At that moment, Victoria's phone rang urgently. Her face paled as she saw the message. "Richard has had a crisis. He's asking for you." Night had completely fallen over the city, and in that small living room in Greenwich Village, 4 people faced a decision that could change their lives forever. The aroma of sandwiches still lingered in the air, reminding them that sometimes fate uses the simplest means to unite the most complex paths. In the most exclusive private hospital in New York City, Dawn found Sarah contemplating the city from a window on the 10th floor. The night before, after a long discussion, she had decided to accompany Alexander and Victoria. Grace, however, had refused to come, arguing that she needed time to process everything. "Coffee?" Alexander's voice interrupted her thoughts. He was extending a cup from the hospital cafeteria. "Thanks," Sarah replied, accepting the drink. "It's strange. All my life I wondered what my father was like, and now that I'm just a few meters from his room, I don't know if I want to go in." "I understand." Alexander leaned against the window. "I spent the last 6 months living on the streets, trying to understand how the man who raised me could be capable of so much deception." A nurse approached them hurriedly. "Blackwell family? Mr. Richard is awake and asking for you." Victoria, who had been talking with the doctors, joined her children. "Sarah, honey, if you're not ready—" "I am," Sarah interrupted, straightening up with determination. "I've waited 23 years for this moment." As they walked towards the room, at the sandwich stand in Greenwich Village, Grace was opening the business with trembling hands. The weight of memories overwhelmed her. "Grace?" A familiar voice made her turn. It was Isabel, her best friend and confidant of a lifetime. "I saw you closed early yesterday. Is everything okay?" "Isabel?" Grace collapsed into her friend's arms. "The whole past has come back. Richard. Sarah is with him now." At the hospital, Sarah, Alexander, and Victoria entered the room. Richard Blackwell, once an imposing man, lay connected to various monitors. His eyes opened as he heard the footsteps, and upon seeing Sarah, tears began to roll down his cheeks. "You're identical to your mother," he whispered in a weak voice. "As beautiful as she was at your age." Sarah felt her heart racing. All the anger she had imagined feeling now mixed with a confused compassion. "Alexander," Richard continued, looking at his son, "forgive me. You were right to leave, to despise me." "I didn't come for your apologies, Father," Alexander responded firmly. "I came because Sarah deserves answers." Richard nodded weakly. "I owe you both the truth. Victoria, love, could you leave us alone?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded and left the room. Richard waited for the door to close before continuing. "What I did to your mother, Sarah, was unforgivable. I fell in love with her sincerely, but I was a coward. Society, what people would say, the family empire. I allowed all that to weigh more than love." "Why did you keep her letters?" Alexander asked. "If appearances mattered so much to you, why didn't you destroy them?" "Because they were the only thing that kept me human," Richard replied. Each letter, each photo that Grace sent of Sarah, I kept them as both a treasure and a punishment. They were the reminder of my greatest failure as a human being. Sarah approached the bed, studying the face of the man who had given her life, but denied her his presence. "Did you ever think about looking for me?" "Every day," Richard replied, extending a trembling hand towards her. "But each day I was more cowardly than the last, until Alexander found the letters and everything crumbled. And now what do you expect from us?" Sarah asked, without taking his hand. "What do you want?" "I want to do things right, for once in my life," Richard coughed weakly. "I've modified my will. Half of the Blackwell Empire will be yours, Sarah. It's what should have always been." "I don't want your money," Sarah replied firmly. "I didn't come for that." "I know," Richard smiled sadly. "You're like your mother, with a heart of gold, But it's not just money I want to give you. It's your place in the family, your heritage, your identity. At that moment, Victoria hurriedly re-entered the room. Richard, the doctors need to examine you. As the medical team entered, Sarah and Alexander went out into the hallway. They looked at each other in silence, processing everything that had happened. "What are you going to do?" Alexander finally asked. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. "But I think Mom needs to be here. This story can't end without them seeing each other one last time." In the Greenwich Village market, Isabel listened attentively as Grace poured out 23 years of kept secrets. The stand remained closed, with an improvised "back soon" sign hanging in front. "There's something I never told you, Isabel." Grace dried her tears with the back of her hand. "The night Richard threw me out of the mansion, it wasn't just because of the pregnancy." Isabel leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "That night, I found documents in his office, papers that proved the Blackwell fortune wasn't as clean as it appeared. Richard was desperate to keep up appearances, not just because of the pregnancy, but because he feared I knew too much." At that moment, Grace's cell phone vibrated with a message from Sarah. "Mom, he needs you. Please come." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Alexander and Sarah shared a moment of calm in the cafeteria. Victoria had gone up to Richard's room. "You know, I always wanted to have a sister," Alexander commented, stirring his coffee. "Although I must admit I didn't imagine finding her selling the best sandwiches in New York." Sarah smiled slightly. "And I didn't imagine my brother would be a millionaire who chose to live on the streets because of moral principles." "Ex-millionaire, technically," Alexander corrected. "I renounced everything when I discovered the truth, although now it seems Father wants to return to you what's rightfully yours." "I don't want his money," Sarah insisted. "I just want to understand everything." "There's more to the story than we imagine," Alexander lowered his voice. "During my months on the street, I investigated. The Blackwells have dark secrets, Sarah. Father didn't just deny you, he denied many truths." Before he could continue, Victoria appeared in the cafeteria, her face pale. "The doctors say he's getting worse. He wants to see Grace." In the market, Grace read her daughter's message over and over again. Isabel put a hand on her shoulder. "Go," she said softly. "If you don't do it now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." "What if I'm not ready to forgive?" Grace whispered. "Forgiveness isn't for him," Isabel replied. "It's for you." An hour later, Grace entered the hospital, her heart pounding. In the elevator, she remembered the last time she had seen Richard, that stormy night when he threw her out of the mansion. When she reached the floor, she found Sarah waiting for her. "Mom," her daughter whispered, hugging her, "there's so much we don't know." "I know, my love," Grace replied. "That's why I'm here." Alexander approached them. "Father is conscious now. The doctors say it's time." Grace took a deep breath and walked towards the room. As she opened the door, 23 years of absence condensed into an instant. Richard lay in the bed, older and more fragile than she remembered, but with the same green eyes that had once made her fall in love. "Grace," he whispered, extending a trembling hand. "You came." "Not for you," she responded firmly. "For our daughter." Victoria, who was by the window, moved uncomfortably. "I'll leave you alone." "No," Grace stopped her. "Stay. We all need to hear the whole truth." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "You're right. It's time for everyone to know the truth. About the pregnancy, about the documents you found that night, about everything." Sarah and Alexander quietly entered the room, closing the door behind them. The moment that would change their lives forever was about to begin. "That night," Richard began, "I didn't just throw you out because of the pregnancy, Grace. I threw you out because you discovered something that could have destroyed not only the Blackwells, but all the powerful families in New York." The silence in the hospital room became dense as Richard gathered strength to continue. The heart monitors marked an irregular rhythm, as if even his heart feared the truths that were about to be revealed. "The documents you found that night, Grace," Richard continued, "revealed that the Blackwell fortune was built on a lie. My father, William Blackwell, didn't inherit the hotels from his family as everyone believes." Victoria approached the bed, her face showing a mixture of surprise and fear. "Richard, what are you saying?" "The truth, Victoria. The truth I've kept for decades." Richard coughed slightly before continuing. The hotels originally belonged to the Thompson family. Sarah and Grace exchanged looks of astonishment. Alexander, who had remained silent, moved closer to the bed. "Grace's family?" he asked, incredulous. "Yes," Richard responded. "Your grandfather, Grace Frank Thompson, was the true owner of the hotel chain. He was a visionary man who built an empire from scratch. My father was his accountant and best friend, or so Frank thought." Grace brought a hand to her chest. "My father never talked about hotels. He was a simple market trader. Because he lost everything," Richard explained. "My father falsified documents, manipulated contracts, and little by little transferred the ownership of the hotels to his name. When Frank discovered the deception, my father used his connections to ruin him. He left him on the street, threatening to destroy his entire family if he spoke. That's why Grandma Rose started the sandwich business," Grace whispered, the pieces fitting together in her mind. "To survive after losing everything. And years later," Richard continued, his voice breaking, "history repeated itself. When you found those documents, I acted just like my father. I pushed you away, I threatened you, I perpetuated the cycle of lies and betrayal." Alexander hit the wall in frustration. "All this time we lived a lie. The fortune we enjoyed, the mansion, the hotels, everything was stolen." "That's why you went to live on the streets," Sarah realized, looking at her brother. "You couldn't live with that truth. And that's why I want to do the right thing now," Richard intervened. "Sarah, the half of the hotels I want to leave you isn't a gift. It's a restitution. It's what should have always belonged to your family." Victoria, who had remained silent, approached Grace. "Now I understand why Richard changed so much after meeting you. You were Frank's granddaughter. It was as if fate had conspired to expose the truth." "Fate," Grace murmured. "Or perhaps my mother's sandwich recipe. Grandma Rose always said that recipe had saved our family once, and that it would do so again when necessary." Suddenly Richard began to stir, the monitors emitting alarm signals. The nurses quickly entered the room, asking everyone to leave. In the hallway, the four remained silent, processing the revelations. Sarah took her mother's hand, while Alexander leaned against the wall, lost in his thoughts. "What are we going to do now?" Victoria finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What Grandma Rose would have wanted," Sarah responded with determination. "Rebuild, not destroy. Heal, not seek revenge." Grace looked at her daughter with pride. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you, of the woman you've become." "The original documents," Alexander interjected. "I have them stored in a safe place. I found them in Father's office when I discovered everything. We could—" "No," Sarah interrupted him. "I don't want to build my future on the past. But I do want to honor the memory of my grandfather Frank and Grandma Rose. I have a better idea." 3 days later, in the kitchen of the sandwich stand, Sarah was explaining her plan to her gathered family. The place was closed, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the steam from the sandwiches that were still the house specialty. "I want to turn the main Blackwell Hotel into a school of traditional American cuisine," Sarah explained, her eyes shining with determination. "A place where family recipes like Grandma Rose's can be preserved and passed on to new generations." Alexander, who had abandoned his worn suit for more casual clothes, nodded thoughtfully. "The Grand Central Hotel. It has the perfect location and enough space." "But that's the most emblematic hotel in the chain," Victoria objected, although her voice lacked conviction. "It's been the face of the Blackwells for decades." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "What better way to honor both the Thompsons and the Blackwells? Turn a symbol of deception into a place of hope and tradition." Grace, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. "Your grandfather Frank always dreamed of creating something that would endure through time, something that would go beyond money. Grandma Rose achieved that with her sandwiches, and now you want to take it further." "Not just that," Sarah continued, taking out some sketches she had been working on. "I want the hotel's main restaurant to be named Frank and Rose's, a tribute to my grandparents and to all the families that keep traditional American cuisine alive." Victoria approached the sketches, studying them with interest. "It's beautiful, and it makes sense commercially. Traditional American cuisine is at its international best right now. And we could offer scholarships," Alexander added, getting excited about the idea. For young people from Greenwich Village and other traditional neighborhoods, preserve not only the recipes, but also the stories behind them. At that moment, Isabel entered the place with news from the hospital. "Richard is stable," she announced. "The doctors say he can return home in a few days." A reflective silence fell over the group. Finally, Grace spoke. "Maybe it's time to let the past rest. Grandma Rose always said that true forgiveness isn't forgetting, but transforming pain into something beautiful. And speaking of transformations," Sarah smiled, "there's something else I want to show you." She took out another set of papers from her bag. "I've been researching cultural preservation programs. There's a foundation that could help us document and preserve traditional recipes from all over America." "The American Flavors Foundation," Alexander read. "They have a presence throughout North America." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And they're interested in our project. They see the potential to create a network of similar schools in other states." Victoria stood up, walking towards the small window that overlooked the square. "Richard needs to know about this. I think for the first time in his life, he could feel truly proud of something." "There's something else," Grace added, heading to the old kitchen cabinet. She took out a worn box and opened it, revealing an ancient recipe book. This was Grandma Rose's recipe diary. It not only contains recipes, but also stories, memories, even some notes from Frank about his dreams for the hotels. Sarah took the book reverently, her fingers caressing the yellowed pages. "It's perfect. We can start by digitizing these recipes, creating an archive that preserves not only the flavors, but also the memories." "And I have an idea for the logo," Isabel interjected, who had been drawing on a napkin. She showed a simple but elegant sketch. Two intertwined hands holding a steaming sandwich. "The hands represent the union of families," she explained, "and the sandwich is what started all this, isn't it?" Everyone smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. At that moment, Alexander's phone rang with a message from the hospital. Richard wanted to see them all. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, looking at her mother and brother. "Ready to write a new chapter," Grace replied, putting the recipe book in her bag, one that Grandma Rose would be proud to read. Richard's hospital room had changed in the last few days. The fresh flowers that Victoria brought every morning filled the environment with their fragrance, and the open curtains let in the evening light. Richard, although still weak, was sitting up in bed, notably more recovered. "A culinary school," Richard repeated after Sarah had explained her plan. His eyes, previously dimmed by guilt, now shone with something akin to hope. "Not just that, Father," Alexander interjected, spreading the plans on the hospital table. "It will be a complete cultural center. The Grand Central Hotel will be transformed into a space where tradition and innovation meet." Grace, who remained near the door, observed the scene with a mixture of emotions. She saw in Sarah the same passion that had characterized Frank, her father, when he talked about his dreams for the hotels. "The main restaurant," Sarah continued, "will bear my grandparents' names, Frank and Rose's. It will be a tribute not only to them, but to all the families who have kept our culinary traditions alive." Richard extended a trembling hand towards the recipe book that Grace had brought. "May I?" he asked softly. Grace approached and handed him the book. Richard opened it carefully, his fingers tracing the yellowed pages filled with Rose's elegant handwriting. "There's something here," he murmured, stopping on a particular page. "A note from Frank." Everyone gathered around as Richard read aloud. "Dear Rose, the hotels are just buildings. The true legacy is in what we do with them. I dream of places where people not only stay, but where they find the taste of a home away from home." Victoria, who had remained silent, wiped away a tear. "It's exactly what Sarah is proposing. And there's more," Alexander added. "The American Flavors Foundation is interested in collaborating. We could create a network of similar schools across America." Richard slowly closed the book, his face reflecting deep reflection. "For years I carried the guilt of what my father did, and then the guilt of my own actions. But this," he gestured towards the plans, "this is redemption." "I'm not looking for redemption," Sarah interrupted firmly. "I'm seeking justice, a justice that doesn't destroy but builds, that doesn't divide but unites." Grace finally approached the bed, standing next to her daughter. "Grandma Rose always said that the best revenge is success. But she didn't mean financial success, but success of the heart. "The hotel," Richard began, but was interrupted by a coughing fit. When he recovered, he continued, "The hotel will be yours, Sarah, completely yours. No conditions, no strings attached." "Ours," Sarah corrected, taking her mother's hand. "It will belong to the family." "To both families." Victoria approached Grace, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "I never asked for your forgiveness," she said softly. "For all these years, for my complicit silence." "Forgiveness," Grace replied, "like good cooking, needs time to develop its flavor. But I think we're on the right path." At that moment, Isabel entered the room with a small thermal box. "Excuse the interruption, but I thought everyone could use some comfort." She opened the box, revealing freshly made sandwiches, prepared with Grandma Rose's recipe. "The first service of the future Frank and Rose's restaurant," Alexander joked, but his voice was laden with emotion. As they shared the sandwiches in that hospital room, something began to heal. It wasn't just Richard's body, but also the wounds of the past, the family fractures, the decades of silence. "You know," Sarah said, holding her sandwich, "Grandma Rose always said that a good sandwich not only feeds the body, but also the soul." "And she was right," Richard replied, tasting his first bite with tears in his eyes. As always, Rose was right. A week later, the lobby of the Grand Central Hotel was buzzing with activity. Architects, designers, and contractors came and went, while Sarah and Alexander supervised the preliminary plans for the renovation. The majestic space, with its marble columns and crystal chandeliers, would soon be transformed into something completely new. "The main area will become the practical classrooms," Sarah explained, pointing to different sections of the plan. "We want to maintain the historical elements of the building, but adapt them to their new purpose." "The current guests are intrigued," Victoria commented, who had just joined the conversation. "Several have asked if they can take short classes during their stay." "That's an excellent idea," Alexander exclaimed, making notes on his tablet. "We could offer special workshops for tourists in addition to the regular programs." Grace, who was observing everything from a corner of the lobby, couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and nostalgia. This very place, where years ago she had worked as an employee, would now be part of her family's legacy. "Miss Blackwell? Or should I say Miss Thompson?" an elegant gentleman interrupted, approaching the group. "I'm Edward Valentine, from the American Flavors Foundation." "Sarah, please," she replied with a warm smile. "And I prefer to be called by both surnames. Blackwell Thompson." "It's time to unite, not divide." Edward nodded approvingly. "I like that philosophy. And speaking of uniting, I have an interesting proposal for you." He opened his briefcase and extracted several documents. "We've been in contact with other traditional families of American cuisine. They're very interested in participating as instructors at the school." "Mom!" Sarah called excitedly. "Come see this." Grace approached the group and her eyes widened in surprise as she recognized some names on the list. "Mrs. Johnson, the one with the famous New England clam chowder, and Mr. Garcia, the barbecue master from Texas." "The very same," Edward confirmed. "Your project has generated a lot of interest in the culinary community. They see this as an opportunity to preserve recipes and techniques that could be lost over time." "It's exactly what Grandma Rose would have wanted," Grace whispered, emotional. At that moment, Isabel came running to the lobby, waving a paper in her hand. "Sarah, Grace, you won't believe what I found." Everyone gathered around her as she unfolded what appeared to be an old hotel blueprint. "I was helping clean out the old office when I found this behind a painting. It's the original design of the hotel, signed by Frank." Grace took the paper with trembling hands. "It's my father's handwriting. And look, there's a note here," she read aloud. "The true luxury isn't in the marble or the chandeliers, but in making every guest feel at home. Someday this place will be more than a hotel. It will be a center where culture and tradition meet." "Grandpa, he had already dreamed of this," Sarah murmured, her eyes shining with contained tears. "And there's more," Isabel continued, pointing to another document. "I found correspondence between Frank and various traditional cooks of the time. He wanted to create a traditional cooking school within the hotel, but my father prevented it," Victoria completed softly. "Richard told me at the hospital. William convinced the board of directors that it was too risky an idea." "Well now," Alexander declared with determination, We're going to make that dream a reality. And we'll do it better than even Grandpa Frank could have imagined. Sarah took the old blueprint and placed it next to the new designs. Look how everything fits together. It's as if the past and present were meeting perfectly. Like the flavor of a good clam chowder, Grace smiled. Layers and layers of history, tradition, and love, blending to create something new and beautiful. Edward observed the scene with evident satisfaction. I think I've just witnessed the true spirit of this project. Would you like to start planning the inauguration ceremony? In the days that followed, as renovations on the Grand Central Hotel progressed, every corner seemed to reveal new secrets. During the cleaning of an old storage room in the basement, workers discovered a hidden safe behind old shelves. We need the combination, Alexander said, examining the rusty mechanism. It must have been decades since it was opened. Sarah studied the safe with curiosity. Look, there's something engraved here as it looks like a date. She cleaned off the dust carefully. 07/22/1963. Grace, who had just arrived with a tray of coffee for the workers, stopped in her tracks. That's my date of birth. Victoria, who was supervising the basement renovation, approached with interest. Would Frank use his daughter's birth date as the combination? With trembling hands, Grace turned the numbers. A click resonated in the silence of the basement, and the safe door opened with a creak. The interior revealed a treasure trove of old documents, photographs, and a personal diary. But what caught everyone's attention most was a yellowed envelope addressed to My Dear Grace. It's Dad's handwriting, Grace whispered, taking the envelope reverently. Read it, Mom, Sarah encouraged as everyone gathered around. Grace opened the envelope and began to read. My dear daughter, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back to the hotel, as I always knew you would. There are truths you need to know, truths that go beyond William Blackwell's betrayal. The hotel wasn't just a business for me. It was your mother's dream before she passed away. She was the one who first imagined the cooking school, who dreamed of a place where America's culinary traditions could be preserved and passed on. In this envelope, you'll find her original recipe book, with notes I never shared with anyone. You'll also find documents that prove William and I weren't just partners. We were brothers. A collective gasp interrupted the reading. Victoria leaned against the wall, visibly affected. Brothers, Alexander whispered. Then we... Grace continued reading. Yes, William was my half-brother, although few knew it. Perhaps that's why his betrayal hurt more. But I don't keep this secret to nurture grudges, but so you understand that the ties that bind our families are deeper than money or business. The true treasure of the Grand Central Hotel isn't in its walls or its bank accounts. It's in the stories its kitchens hold, in the dreams that were cooked in its stoves, in the love your mother put into every recipe she created here. Forgive William as I have finally forgiven him. Hate only poisons the soul, and there are too many delicious recipes to create to embitter our hearts. With eternal love, your father, Frank. The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Richard, in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse, had arrived at the basement. My father, he said in a broken voice. My father never told me we were cousins. We're more than cousins, Sarah replied, taking the old recipe book from the envelope. We're family. And look at this. She opened the recipe book to a marked page. It was the original recipe for the sandwiches that had made the Thompson family famous, but with a special note. For my sister-in-law, Victoria, when she's ready to learn that true wealth is measured in the love we put into what we cook. Victoria approached, her eyes full of tears. My mother knew this recipe. Grace nodded slowly. Grandma Rose always said this recipe had a special secret, something that united families. Now I understand why. And look at the date of this recipe, Alexander pointed out. It was written the day Richard was born. The same day my mother promised to teach me to cook, Victoria murmured. A promise she could never fulfill. Sarah took everyone's hands, forming a circle in that dusty basement. Then let's make this school more than a business project. Let's make it the fulfillment of all those unfulfilled promises. The hotel's experimental kitchen, newly remodeled for future classes, had become the stage for a historic moment. Victoria Blackwell, always elegant in her designer suits, now wore a white apron with the provisional logo of the Frank and Rose's school. "I don't know if I can do this," Victoria whispered, her hands trembling as Grace prepared the ingredients for the sandwiches. "Of course you can," Grace replied softly. "Cooking is in your blood, even if you didn't know it. Your mother knew." Sarah and Alexander observed from the kitchen island, while Isabel documented everything with a professional camera. "This will be perfect for the inauguration video," she commented, focusing on the emotional faces of both women. "First lesson," Grace began, "the perfect sandwich begins long before the bread. It begins with intention, with the love we put into each preparation." Victoria closed her eyes, remembering fragments of her childhood, the aroma that came from the kitchen when her mother prepared something special, the laughter shared in secret with the servants, moments her father had always disapproved of. "Your mother," Grace continued, "used to come to the hotel kitchen in secret. She would sneak away from elegant parties to learn from Rose. They called her the Lady of the Hidden Sandwiches." "My mother?" Victoria opened her eyes, surprised. "But she always seemed so distant from everything related to the kitchen." "Because your father forbade it," Richard interjected from his wheelchair, which had been placed near the kitchen entrance. "He said that society women shouldn't mingle with the servants, but she was happy here." Grace began to guide Victoria's hands in preparing the bread. "Look, like this, soft but firm. The bread must feel your intention." As they worked, Isabel continued filming, capturing the moment when Victoria, for the first time in her life, connected with a part of her history that had remained hidden. "There's something else," Grace said, taking out a small notebook from her bag. "I found this between the pages of your mother's recipe book. They're notes she wrote about you." Victoria stopped her movements, the bread forgotten for a moment. With trembling hands, she took the notebook and read aloud. "My dear Victoria, every time I prepare these sandwiches in secret, I think of you. I dream of the day when we can cook together, without fear, without pretensions. The kitchen is the only place where I feel truly free, where social barriers vanish, and only the love we put into each dish matters. I hope that someday you find your own freedom in these flavors." Tears began to roll down Victoria's cheeks, staining the apron with small dark spots. "Mom always told me she was keeping a special secret for me," she whispered. "I never imagined it would be this." "The secrets of the kitchen," Grace smiled, "are like good spices. Sometimes they're spicy, sometimes they're sweet, but they always transform the dish." Sarah approached her aunt, hugging her shoulders. "You know, we could create a special program at the school. Something that honors the memory of your mother and all the women who cooked in secret, keeping traditions alive despite everything. The Secret Cooks," Alexander suggested. "A course that tells these stories, that rescues these hidden recipes." Victoria nodded, wiping away her tears and returning to the bread with renewed determination. "My mother would be proud to see this. All our mothers would be." "And look at this," Isabel pointed out, who had been reviewing more documents from the basement. "There are photographs of secret meetings in the kitchen, society women learning from traditional cooks. It was a whole clandestine movement." "A movement that can now come to light," Richard affirmed. "As it should have been from the beginning." The bread under Victoria's hands began to take shape, and with it a new tradition was beginning to be born. A tradition that didn't distinguish between surnames or social classes, that united the past with the present through the universal language of cooking. A week after the first sandwich lesson, the main hall of the Grand Central Hotel had been transformed into an improvised museum. Old photographs, yellowed recipes, and traditional cooking utensils were carefully displayed, telling the secret history of the secret cooks. "It's incredible how many women were part of this," Sarah commented, adjusting the frame of a photograph showing a group of elegantly dressed ladies, all wearing aprons over their party dresses. Victoria, who now spent more time in the kitchen than in board meetings, pointed to one of the women in the photo. "This is Mrs. Elizabeth Johnson. Her granddaughter contacted me yesterday. She has all her grandmother's recipe notebooks and wants to donate them to the school. And she's not the only one," Isabel added, checking her tablet. "Since we started sharing this story on social media, we've received messages from families all over America. They all have similar stories. Grandmothers, mothers, and aunts who kept culinary traditions alive in secret." Grace, who was organizing a group of old kitchen utensils, smiled nostalgically. Grandma Rose always said that the true American Revolution happened in kitchens. At that moment, Edward Valentine from the American Flavors Foundation entered the hall, accompanied by an older woman who immediately caught everyone's attention. "Let me introduce you to Mrs. Margaret Davis," Edward announced. She was the head chef of the hotel in the 1960s. Victoria gasped. "Mrs. Maggie? The one who taught my mother in secret." The elderly woman smiled, her eyes shining with recognition. "Victoria, you're identical to her. Your mother was my best student." Alexander, who had been coordinating the international transmissions, approached with exciting news. "All the locations are connected, from New York to Los Angeles, from Chicago to New Orleans. Traditional kitchens across America are uniting today in this celebration." On the screens, simultaneous ceremonies could be seen in other hotels of the chain. In Texas, traditional barbecue masters shared their knowledge. In New England, elderly cooks taught the secrets of clam chowder. At each location, tradition and modernity intertwined in a harmonious dance. Isabel, who had documented the entire process, presented the digital historical archive. "We've created a virtual library where every recipe, every technique, every story will be preserved and shared. The knowledge that was once kept in hiding places and secret codes will now be accessible to everyone." At that moment, a group of international students, representing all regions of America, took the stage. Each carried a dish that fused their cultural traditions with the teachings of the secret cooks. "This is the future our grandmothers dreamed of," Sarah declared, emotional. "A world where traditions aren't lost, but evolve and are enriched by sharing." Grace, looking around, could feel Grandma Rose's presence in every corner of the hotel. "Mom," she whispered, "we did it. Your dream didn't just survive, it grew beyond our borders." The hotel bells rang, officially marking the beginning of a new era. An era where kitchens would no longer be places of division, but bridges between cultures, generations, and hearts. 1 month after the inauguration, the Grand Central Hotel vibrated with a different energy. The hallways, once silent and formal, now resonated with the voices of students from all over the country, learning and sharing knowledge. In the main kitchen, now a modern laboratory of traditional flavors, Victoria was leading a special class. In front of her, students from different states watched attentively as she prepared the sandwich that her mother had taught her through the secret notes. "Each ingredient," Victoria explained passionately, "tells a story. When we toast this bread, we're not just preparing a dish, we're keeping alive the memory of generations." In another classroom, Grace and Mrs. Maggie supervised a unique exchange. An elderly Native American woman was teaching traditional techniques to a young chef from New York, while he shared preservation methods that would help keep ancient recipes alive. "It's beautiful," Grace commented to Mrs. Maggie. "Grandma Rose always said that the kitchen was the place where all languages became one." Sarah, meanwhile, was coordinating via video conference with the other international locations. On the screens, the kitchens of Blackwell hotels in different countries could be seen, each converted into a center for preserving and evolving culinary traditions. "The results of the first month are incredible," Edward reported, showing statistics on his tablet. "We've documented more than 1,000 traditional recipes that were at risk of being lost. Indigenous communities are sharing techniques that had never been recorded before." Richard, who now spent his days between classrooms and his office, observed everything with a mixture of pride and amazement. "If my father could see this, how what he considered a threat has become our greatest treasure." Alexander entered his father's office excitedly. "The confirmation just arrived. UNESCO will not only recognize the secret cooks as cultural heritage, but they'll use our educational model as a global example of preserving culinary traditions." In the garden, Isabel was directing a team of documentarians who were recording the testimonies of the original secret cooks. Their stories would become part of the school's curriculum, ensuring that future generations would know the struggle that made this moment possible. "Every story we document," Isabel explained to the cameras, "is a bridge between the past and the future. The recipes are just the beginning. What we're really preserving is the spirit of resistance and love that kept them alive." During a break between classes, Victoria found her father contemplating the mural of the secret cooks in the lobby. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" she asked softly. About how we tried for so long to hide our true wealth, Richard replied. These women whom we once tried to silence were preserving the true treasure of our family. And look what they've created, Victoria smiled. Not just a school, but a global movement. At that moment, a group of excited students ran by. They had successfully reproduced an ancient recipe that was thought to be lost. Professor Victoria, a young student from Texas, called. You have to try this. We combined the traditional sandwich technique with methods of Southern barbecue. Victoria tasted the dish, and her eyes filled with tears. It tastes like the future, she whispered. Like living tradition, evolving without losing itself. Grace, who had approached the group, smiled wisely. Grandma Rose always said that recipes are like rivers. They must flow and adapt, but never forget their source. The afternoon sun streamed through the hotel's windows, illuminating the faces of 3 generations united by their love for cooking and its traditions. In every corner of the building, the legacy of the secret cooks not only survived, but flourished in ways that not even they could have imagined. 6 months after the inauguration, the Grand Central Hotel was preparing for a special event, the first graduation of students from the International School of Secret Cooks. The former ballroom, now converted into a multi-purpose space, was decorated with historical photographs and traditional aromatic herbs. Victoria, elegant in a suit that combined elements of high fashion with traditional embroidery, was supervising the final details when Sarah arrived with exciting news. You won't believe this, she exclaimed, waving a letter. The Culinary Institute of America wants to establish a permanent exchange program. They say our teaching methods have revolutionized the way of preserving culinary traditions. Grace, who was preparing the dishes for the ceremony with her students. Well now, Alexander declared with determination, we're going to make that dream a reality. And we'll do it better than even Grandpa Frank could have imagined. Sarah took the old blueprint and placed it next to the new designs. Look how everything fits together. It's as if the past and present were meeting perfectly. Like the flavor of a good clam chowder, Grace smiled. Layers and layers of history, tradition, and love, blending to create something new and beautiful. Edward observed the scene with evident satisfaction. I think I've just witnessed the true spirit of this project. Would you like to start planning the inauguration ceremony? In the days that followed, as renovations on the Grand Central Hotel progressed, every corner seemed to reveal new secrets. During the cleaning of an old storage room in the basement, workers discovered a hidden safe behind old shelves. We need the combination, Alexander said, examining the rusty mechanism. It must have been decades since it was last opened. Sarah studied the safe with curiosity. Look, there's something engraved here as it looks like a date. She cleaned off the dust carefully. 07/22/1963. Grace, who had just arrived with a tray of coffee for the workers, stopped in her tracks. That's my date of birth. Victoria, who was supervising the basement renovation, approached with interest. Would Frank use his daughter's birth date as the combination? With trembling hands, Grace turned the numbers. A click resonated in the silence of the basement, and the safe door opened with a creak. The interior revealed a treasure trove of old documents, photographs, and a personal diary. But what caught everyone's attention was a yellowed envelope addressed to My Dear Grace. It's Dad's handwriting, Grace whispered, taking the envelope reverently. Read it, Mom, Sarah encouraged as everyone gathered around. Grace opened the envelope and began to read. My dear daughter, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back to the hotel, as I always knew you would. There are truths you need to know, truths that go beyond William Blackwell's betrayal. The hotel wasn't just a business for me. It was your mother's dream before she passed away. She was the one who first imagined the cooking school, who dreamed of a place where America's culinary traditions could be preserved and passed on. In this envelope, you'll find her original recipe book, with notes I've never shared with anyone. You'll also find documents that prove William and I weren't just partners. We were brothers. A collective gasp interrupted the reading. Victoria leaned against the wall, visibly affected. Brothers, Alexander whispered. Then we... Grace continued reading. Yes, William was my half-brother, though few knew it. Perhaps that's why his betrayal hurt more. But I don't keep this secret to nurture grudges. But so you understand that the ties that bind our families are deeper than money or business. The true treasure of the Grand Central Hotel isn't in its walls or its bank accounts. It's in the stories its kitchens hold, in the dreams that were cooked in its ovens, in the love your mother put into every recipe she created here. Forgive William as I have finally forgiven him. Hate only poisons the soul, and there are too many delicious recipes to create to embitter our hearts. With eternal love, your father, Frank. The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Richard, in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse, had arrived at the basement. "My father," he said with a broken voice. "My father never told me we were cousins." "We're more than cousins," Sarah responded, taking the old recipe book from the envelope. "We're family. And look at this." She opened the recipe book to a marked page. It was the original recipe for the sandwiches that had made the Thompson family famous, but with a special note: "For my sister-in-law, Victoria, when she's ready to learn that true wealth is measured in the love we put into what we cook." Victoria approached, her eyes full of tears. My mother knew this recipe." Grace nodded slowly. "Grandma Rose always said this recipe had a special secret, something that united families. Now I understand why. And look at the date on this recipe," Alexander pointed out. "It was written the day Richard was born." "The same day my mother promised to teach me how to cook," Victoria murmured. A promise she never got to fulfill. Sarah took everyone's hands, forming a circle in that dusty basement. "Then let's make this school more than just a business project. Let's make it the fulfillment of all those unfinished promises." The hotel's experimental kitchen, newly remodeled for future classes, had become the stage for a historic moment. Victoria Blackwell, always elegant in her designer suits, now wore a white apron with the provisional logo of the Frank and Rose's school. "I don't know if I can do this," Victoria whispered, her hands trembling as Grace prepared the ingredients for the sandwiches. "Of course you can," Grace responded softly. "Cooking is in your blood, even if you didn't know it." "Your mother knew." Sarah and Alexander observed from the kitchen island, while Isabel documented everything with a professional camera. "This will be perfect for the inauguration video," she commented, focusing on the emotional faces of both women. "First lesson," Grace began. "The perfect sandwich starts long before the bread. It starts with intention, with the love we put into each preparation." Victoria closed her eyes, remembering fragments of her childhood, the aroma that came from the kitchen when her mother prepared something special, the laughter shared in secret with the servants, moments her father had always disapproved of. "Your mother," Grace continued, "used to come to the hotel kitchen in secret. She would sneak away from the elegant parties to learn from Rose. They called her the Lady of the Hidden Sandwiches." "My mother?" Victoria opened her eyes, surprised, but she always seemed so distant from everything related to the kitchen. "Because your father forbade it," Richard interjected from his wheelchair, which had been placed near the kitchen entrance. "He said that society women shouldn't mingle with the servants, but she was happy here." Grace began to guide Victoria's hands in preparing the bread. "Look, like this, soft but firm. The bread must feel your intention." As they worked, Isabel continued filming, capturing the moment when Victoria, for the first time in her life, connected with a part of her history that had remained hidden. "There's something else," Grace said, taking out a small notebook from her bag. "I found this between the pages of your mother's recipe book. They're notes she wrote about you." Victoria stopped her movements, the bread forgotten for a moment. With trembling hands, she took the notebook and read aloud. "My dear Victoria, every time I prepare these sandwiches in secret, I think of you. I dream of the day when we can cook together without fear, without pretensions. The kitchen is the only place where I feel truly free, where social barriers vanish and only the love we put into each dish matters. I hope that someday you'll find your own freedom in these flavors." Tears began to roll down Victoria's cheeks, staining the apron with small, dark drops. "Mom always told me she was keeping a special secret for me," she whispered. "I never imagined it would be this." "The secrets of the kitchen," Grace smiled, "are like good spices. Sometimes they're spicy, sometimes they're sweet, but they always transform the dish." Sarah approached her aunt, hugging her shoulders. "You know, we could create a special program at the school. Something that honors the memory of your mother and all the women who cooked in secret, keeping traditions alive despite everything. The Secret Cooks, Alexander suggested. A course that tells these stories, that rescues these guarded recipes. Victoria nodded, wiping away her tears and returning to the bread with renewed determination. My mother would be proud to see this. All our mothers would be. And look at this, Isabel pointed out, who had been reviewing more documents from the basement. There are photographs of secret meetings in the kitchen, society women learning from traditional cooks. It was a whole clandestine movement. A movement that can now come to light, Richard affirmed. As it should have been from the beginning. The bread under Victoria's hands began to take shape, and with it a new tradition was beginning to be born. A tradition that didn't distinguish between surnames or social classes, that united the past with the present through the universal language of cooking. A week after the first sandwich lesson, the main hall of the Grand Central Hotel had been transformed into an improvised museum. Old photographs, yellowed recipes, and traditional kitchen utensils were carefully exhibited, telling the secret history of the secret cooks. It's incredible how many women were part of this, Sarah commented, adjusting the frame of a photograph showing a group of elegantly dressed ladies, all wearing aprons over their party dresses. Victoria, who now spent more time in the kitchen than in board meetings, pointed to one of the women in the photo. This is Mrs. Beatrice Urquhart. Her granddaughter contacted me yesterday. She has all her grandmother's recipe notebooks and wants to donate them to the school. And she's not the only one, Isabel added, checking her tablet. Since we started sharing this story on social media, we've received messages from families all over America. They all have similar stories. Grandmothers, mothers, and aunts who kept culinary traditions alive in secret. Grace, who was organizing a group of old kitchen utensils, smiled nostalgically. Grandma Rose always said that the true American Revolution happened in kitchens. At that moment, Edward Valentine from the American Flavors Foundation entered the hall, accompanied by an older woman who immediately caught everyone's attention. "Let me introduce you to Mrs. Mercedes Ortiz," Edward announced. She was the head chef of the hotel in the 1960s. Victoria gasped. "Mrs. Mercy, the one who taught my mother in secret." The old woman smiled, her eyes shining with recognition. "Victoria, you're identical to her. Your mother was my best student." Alexander, who had been coordinating the international transmissions, approached with interest. "Mrs. Mercedes, did you know Frank?" "Know him? He was the one who created all this," the old woman responded, gesturing towards the photographs. "Frank understood that America's true wealth was in its kitchens, not in its ballrooms." Richard, who was observing everything from his wheelchair, spoke softly. "That's why my father betrayed him, isn't it? It wasn't just about the money." Mrs. Mercedes nodded. "William Blackwell wanted an international luxury hotel. Frank dreamed of a space that would celebrate our roots. The secret cooks were his form of resistance. And now," Sarah interjected, "we can make that dream a reality. But we need your help, Mrs. Mercy. We want new generations to learn not just the recipes, but the stories behind them." The old cook approached a display case where ancient mortars and pestles were exhibited. "Each of these utensils has a story. Each recipe is a piece of our identity. I'll teach you everything I know." "And there's more," Edward added, taking out some documents from his briefcase. "UNESCO is interested in declaring this secret cooks movement as intangible cultural heritage. Its impact on the preservation of American cuisine was more significant than we imagined." Victoria approached Mrs. Mercedes, taking her wrinkled hands in hers. "Would you tell me more about my mother? About what you cooked together?" "Even better," the old woman smiled. "I'll teach you. Just as I taught her. The kitchen has its own memory, you know. In every movement, in every technique is the memory of those who came before us." Grace observed the scene with tears in her eyes. Grandma Rose was right. She said that someday, all the stories these walls held would come to light. And they won't just come to light, Sarah affirmed with determination. They'll become the foundation of something new, something that honors both the past and the future. As the afternoon sun entered through the hotel's windows, bathing the photographs and recipes with its golden light, the spirit of all those secret cooks seemed to fill the space. Their stories, long silenced, finally found their voice on the walls of the Grand Central Hotel. A mild Saturday morning found Mrs. Mercedes seated in the hotel's renovated kitchen, surrounded by Victoria, Sarah, Grace, and Isabel. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sweet bread filled the air as the old cook dusted off her memories. "Your mother," she said, addressing Victoria as she took out a worn recipe book, had a special way of preparing pot roast. She said that each ingredient should be seared while thinking of the person who would eat it. Victoria caressed the yellowed pages, recognizing her mother's elegant handwriting. "I never understood why she distanced herself so much from the kitchen in her later years." "She didn't distance herself by choice," Mrs. Mercedes replied, her voice laden with sadness. "It was after William discovered the secret meetings. He threatened to send her away from you if she continued with her improper behavior for a lady." "My grandfather did that?" Alexander asked, who had just entered the kitchen. "Your grandfather feared that American traditions would taint the hotel's international prestige," the old woman explained. "But there's something he never knew." She slowly stood up and headed to a specific corner of the kitchen. Here, behind this panel, with Alexander's help, they removed a wall panel, revealing a small hidden space. Inside, they found a metal box. "The cook's treasure," Mrs. Mercedes smiled. "Every woman who cooked in secret here kept something special." Upon opening the box, they found a collage of memories, photographs, recipes, small notes, and even a tiny apron. "This apron," Mrs. Mercedes said, taking it carefully. "Your mother made it for you, Victoria. She hoped to give it to you when you were old enough to cook together." Victoria took the small garment, her fingers tracing the embroidered initials, VB. "I never knew about this." "And look at this," Grace pointed out, taking out a photograph. In it, 3 smiling women could be seen, Victoria's mother, Rose, and a third that everyone recognized. "It's Isabel Montenegro," Sarah exclaimed, "the famous chef who revolutionized American cuisine in the 70s. "Yes," Mrs. Mercedes confirmed, "Isabel started here in our secret meetings. Your mother, Victoria, was the one who inspired her to pursue her dream of becoming a professional chef. But there's more," the old woman continued, taking out a sealed envelope. "This envelope contains something your mother wrote for you, Victoria. She asked me to keep it here and only give it to you when you were ready to receive her culinary legacy." With trembling hands, Victoria opened the envelope. "My dear Victoria, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way to the kitchen, the place where I've always been happiest. Society may say that a woman of our class doesn't belong among pots and pans, but the truth is that this is where I found my true essence. Each recipe in my book tells a love story, love for our traditions, for our culture, and above all, love for you. Every dish I learned to prepare, I did thinking of the day we could cook it together. If I couldn't teach you in life, I hope these recipes, these memories kept in secret, will guide you. The kitchen, my love, is more than a place to prepare food. It's a sanctuary where women of all social classes have met as equals, where we've kept our secrets and preserved our identity. With eternal love, Mum." The silence that followed was only interrupted by the soft bubbling of a pot where Mrs. Mercedes had begun to prepare hot chocolate. "Your mother," the old woman said, serving the drink in traditional clay cups, "would be proud to see what this hotel will become. A place where finally the secret kitchens will come to light. And not just that," Sarah added, "but a place where her legacy will continue through every student who learns these recipes, these stories." Victoria, still holding the child-sized apron, stood up with determination. "Mrs. Mercy, would you teach me how to prepare pot roast the way you taught my mother?" The old woman smiled, her eyes shining with contained tears. "I thought you'd never ask, my dear." The news of the secret cooks of the Grand Central Hotel had spread like the aroma of cinnamon and clove throughout the city. That morning, the experimental kitchen was buzzing with activity as Victoria had her first formal pot roast lesson with Mrs. Mercedes. "The secret," the old woman explained as she guided Victoria's hands in searing the meat, "isn't just in the ingredients, but in the time we dedicate to each step. Your mother used to say that pot roast is like life itself, complex, patient, and full of layers of flavor." Sarah was filming the scene for the school's historical archive, while Grace and Isabel organized more documents found in the kitchen's hiding place. "Look at this," Isabel exclaimed, pulling out a group of letters tied with a worn ribbon. They're letters between Victoria's mother and other secret cooks from different hotels across the country. Other hotels? Alexander asked, who had just entered with Richard in his wheelchair. Mrs. Mercedes nodded without stopping her supervision of the meat searing. The secret cooks weren't just from this hotel. We were a network that extended across all of America. We called ourselves the Flavor Guardians, like a secret society, Richard murmured. But instead of political conspiracies, they shared recipes and traditions. More than that, Mrs. Mercedes responded. We were guardians of a way of life that was being lost. When the grand hotels began to prefer international cuisine, we kept the flame of our traditions alive. Victoria, concentrating on her task, felt that each movement connected her more with her mother. Is that why you kept everything secret? To protect the recipes? To protect our identity, Mrs. Mercedes corrected. Each recipe tells the story of a family, of a town, of a tradition. Your mother understood that better than anyone. Suddenly, Grace let out a small cry as she opened one of the letters. I can't believe it. This letter, it's from my mother to yours, Victoria. Everyone gathered around as Grace read, Dear Elizabeth, the pot roast we prepared together last week reminded me why our kitchens are so important. They're not just places to prepare food, they're sanctuaries where social differences vanish and where we're all simply women preserving the soul of America. Your daughter Victoria has your same bright eyes when she watches the preparation of dishes. Someday, when times change, our daughters will continue this legacy together, without needing to hide. With love, Rose. Our mothers, Victoria whispered, were secret friends. More than friends, Mrs. Mercedes smiled. They were sisters in the kitchen, as you are now. Sarah approached Victoria, taking her hands stained with spices. And look how fate has united us exactly as they dreamed. At that moment, Edward Valentine entered the kitchen with an excited expression. You have to see this. He spread several documents on the table. We've found records of the Flavor Guardians in hotels across the country. It was an immense network of women dedicated to preserving traditional recipes. And each hotel, he continued, had its own hiding place in the kitchen like the one you found here. We're talking about a national culinary treasure that has remained hidden for decades. Richard, who had remained silent, spoke with a broken voice. All this time, while my father tried to internationalize the hotels, these women were fighting to keep our essence alive. And now, Sarah declared with determination, we're not only going to preserve that legacy, but we're going to celebrate it. Openly. The school will be a tribute to all those women. Victoria, returning to her pot roast, noticed that the tears falling into the sauce mixed with the flavors, just as her mother had described in her notes. Each emotion adds its own seasoning to the dish. Pot roast, Mrs. Mercedes said softly, like life tastes better when shared. The news about the Flavor Guardians had triggered a chain reaction across America. In just a week, the Grand Central Hotel had become the epicenter of a national movement to recover the country's culinary memory. Letters have arrived from all states, Isabel explained, organizing the correspondence on the improvised meeting table in the kitchen. Families from New England, the South, the Midwest, all with similar stories about their mothers and grandmothers who were part of the network. Sarah studied a map of the United States, where they had begun to mark the points where secret kitchens existed. It's incredible. Every important hotel in the country had its own group of guardians. And look at this, Edward intervened, unfolding an ancient document. We found the original manifesto of the Flavor Guardians, written by Rose and Victoria's mother. Grace took the paper reverently while Mrs. Mercedes approached to listen. We, the guardians of the ancestral flavors of America, commit ourselves to preserve not only the recipes of our towns, but the stories, techniques, and love that make them unique. In times where modernity threatens to erase our traditions, we swear to keep alive the flame of our kitchens, transmitting this knowledge to future generations. May every stove be a school, every recipe a history lesson, and every dish an act of resistance and love for our culture. Signed by the Flavor Guardians, 1965. Victoria, who had been practicing the preparation of pot roast under Mrs. Mercedes's supervision, stopped to listen. It's as if they had predicted what we're doing now. They didn't predict it, the old cook smiled. They dreamed it and planted the seed. You are making that dream blossom. Alexander, who had been reviewing legal documents, looked up from his papers. I have an idea. What if we expand the project? Instead of a single school, we could create a national network of traditional cooking schools. Use the Blackwell hotels as culinary preservation centers? Richard asked from his chair. Exactly, Alexander continued. Each hotel has its own history, its own guardians, its own local recipes. We could create a program that connects all these traditions. The Guardian's Trail, Sarah suggested, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. A circuit that connects all the hotels and their traditional kitchens. Edward nodded with approval. UNESCO would be very interested in a project of this magnitude. We would be preserving not just recipes, but an entire cultural heritage. And we could start here, Grace added. The Grand Central Hotel would be the central headquarters, the place where it all began. Victoria wiped her hands on her apron and approached the group. The first Guardians united their knowledge in secret. Now we can do the same, but in broad daylight, celebrating each tradition, each story. And there's more, Isabel said, pulling out more documents from the hiding place. I found records of international meetings. The Guardians not only preserved American recipes, but also exchanged knowledge with traditional cooks from other countries. A true culinary resistance movement, Richard murmured, taking one of the documents. While the grand hotels were globalizing, these women were creating international networks to protect the traditional cuisines of each country. Mrs. Mercedes approached the pot roast that Victoria had been preparing and tasted it delicately. Perfect, she smiled. You've captured the essence. Your mother would be proud. And this is just the beginning, Sarah declared, looking at the map full of markers. Each point on this map represents a story waiting to be told, a tradition that deserves to be preserved. The group gathered around the map, while the aroma of Victoria's pot roast filled the kitchen, reminding them that some revolutions begin with a simple dish, prepared with love and resistance. 2 weeks before the official inauguration of the school, the old boardroom of the Grand Central Hotel had been transformed into an improvised operations center. Maps, photographs, and documents covered the walls, while representatives from various hotels in the Blackwell chain met to discuss the expansion of the project. So far, we've identified 32 hotels with documented stories of the Flavor Guardians, Sarah explained, pointing to spots on the national map, each with its own recipes, its own traditions. Victoria, who now divided her time between board meetings and cooking classes, added, and in each hotel we've found hiding places similar to ours, full of recipes and documents. The most surprising thing, Edward Valentine interjected, is the organization they had. Look at this. He unfolded an old document on the central table. They had a coded communication system using recipes as messages. Grace approached the document with interest. The quantities in the recipes, they're not just measurements, are they? No, Mrs. Mercedes confirmed, smiling. Each ingredient, each quantity, had a special meaning. For example, when a recipe mentioned 3 bay leaves, it meant there would be a meeting in 3 days. They were more astute than we imagined, Alexander commented with admiration. While the men ran the hotels from their offices, the women were leading a revolution from the kitchens, Richard completed, his voice laden with emotion. And to think we tried to suppress them for so long. At that moment, Isabel ran into the room waving a group of newly developed photographs. You have to see this. We found them in the hotel in New Orleans. The images showed groups of women in different kitchens, all with the same gleam of determination in their eyes. But one photograph in particular caught everyone's attention. It showed Victoria's mother and Rose alongside a group of African-American women, all preparing gumbo. That photo was taken in 1967, Mrs. Mercedes explained. It was when the Guardians decided that preserving the recipes of high society wasn't enough. They began to travel to African-American communities, learning and documenting their culinary traditions. That's why my mother disappeared for days, Victoria whispered. She wasn't at spas like my father said. She was in the bayous of Louisiana, in the heart of the South, in Midwestern communities, Mrs. Mercedes confirmed. Learning, documenting, preserving. Sarah took one of the photographs where her grandmother Rose could be seen teaching a group of young women. They weren't just preserving recipes, were they? They were creating bridges between different worlds. The kitchen, Mrs. Mercedes responded, has always been the place where differences fade away, where a society lady and an African-American cook can be equals before the stove. And that's exactly what we want for our schools, Grace declared, not just to teach techniques and recipes, but to preserve that philosophy of equality and respect. I have a proposal, Edward intervened. Why don't we inaugurate the school with a festival that brings together traditional cooks from all over the country? We could call it the Guardians Gathering. Victoria's eyes lit up. And we could invite the daughters and granddaughters of the original Guardians, create a bridge between the past and the future. More than that, Alexander added. We could document their stories, create an audiovisual archive that preserves not only the recipes, but the experiences of these extraordinary women. Grandma Rose, Grace remembered with a smile, always said that every recipe has 3 main ingredients: memory, love, and resistance. And we, Sarah concluded, looking at the map full of markers, are adding a 4th ingredient: justice. Justice for all those women who kept our culture alive from the shadows. As the group continued planning, the aroma of a new pot roast filtered from the kitchen, where a group of students was learning under Mrs. Mercedes's tutelage. The future and the past intertwined in every dish, in every shared story. The gardens of the Grand Central Hotel had never seen so much activity. 3 days before the grand inaugural festival, white tents rose like giant flowers, each dedicated to a different region of America. The aroma of spices and fresh herbs floated in the air as traditional cooks began to arrive from all corners of the country. "Mrs. Soledad," Victoria exclaimed, running to hug an elderly Texan woman getting out of a van. "I can't believe you came all the way from San Antonio." "How could I not come?" the old woman smiled. "Your mother was my most dedicated student. She taught me that flavors know no social classes." Sarah was supervising the installation of the cooking stations when she noticed Grace standing in front of one of the tents, holding an old photograph. "What did you find, Mom?" "Look," Grace replied, showing the image. "This photo was taken exactly in this garden 40 years ago. Grandma Rose teaching a group of high society women how to make her famous apple pie." Mrs. Mercedes approached, leaning on her cane. "Ah, I remember that day. It was when we decided that traditional recipes shouldn't remain only in popular kitchens. The true revolution was for all social classes to learn to value our roots." At that moment, a group of young culinary students, scholarship recipients of the new program, timidly approached Mrs. Mercedes. "Teachers," one of them said, "we found something while cleaning the garden fountain." The young woman extended a small metal box, rusted by time but still sealed. Victoria recognized it immediately. "It's my mother's seal. She used to mark her most important belongings like this." Carefully, they opened the box. Inside, they found a notebook wrapped in cloth and a letter dated 1 week before Victoria's mother left the kitchen forever. "Read it," Grace encouraged Victoria. "It's part of our history." Victoria began to read aloud. "Dear guardians of the future, if you found this box, it means the time has come. The gardens of this hotel have witnessed our silent resistance, our love for the traditions we were denied the right to practice openly. But I dreamed of a day when our daughters and granddaughters could cook under the sun, without hiding, celebrating each recipe as the cultural treasure it is. I dreamed of a time when kitchens would not be places of division, but of union. In this notebook, I have kept not only recipes, but dreams. Dreams of an America where traditional culinary art is valued as much as the finest European gastronomy, where every cook, regardless of their origin, is recognized as a guardian of our identity. To those who find this box, continue our legacy. Don't just preserve the recipes, preserve the spirit of sisterhood that was born in these kitchens. With love, Elizabeth Blackwell, guardian of the Grand Central Hotel." Tears ran down Victoria's cheeks as she finished reading. Alexander, who had been filming everything for the documentary, had to pause to regain his composure. "Your mother," Mrs. Mercedes said softly, "never stopped being a guardian. Even when they forced her to abandon the kitchen, she continued transmitting her knowledge in secret. And now," Sarah interjected, "we can make that dream a reality. But we need your help, Mrs. Mercy. We want new generations to learn not just the recipes, but the stories behind them." The old cook approached a display case where ancient cast-iron pots and pans were exhibited. Each of these utensils has a story. Each recipe is a piece of our identity. I'll teach you everything I know. And there's more, Edward added, pulling out some documents from his briefcase. UNESCO is interested in declaring this Flavor Guardians movement as intangible cultural heritage. Its impact on the preservation of American cuisine was more significant than we imagined. Victoria approached Mrs. Mercedes, taking her wrinkled hands in hers. Would you tell me more about my mother? About what you cooked together? Even better, the old woman smiled. I'll teach you, just as I taught her. The kitchen has its own memory, you know. In every movement, in every technique, is the memory of those who came before us. Grace observed the scene with tears in her eyes. Grandma Rose was right. She said that someday, all the stories these walls held would come to light. And they won't just come to light, Sarah affirmed with determination. They'll become the foundation of something new, something that honors both the past and the future. As the afternoon sun entered through the hotel's windows, bathing the photographs and recipes with its golden light, the spirit of all those secret cooks seemed to fill the space. Their stories, long silenced, finally found their voice on the walls of the Grand Central Hotel. A month after the inauguration, the Grand Central Hotel vibrated with a different energy. The corridors, once silent and formal, now resonated with the voices of students from all over the world learning and sharing knowledge. In the main kitchen, now a modern laboratory of traditional flavors, Victoria led a special class. In front of her, students from different countries watched attentively as she prepared the pot roast her mother had taught her through secret notes. Each ingredient, Victoria explained passionately, tells a story. When we sear this meat, we're not just preparing a dish, we're keeping alive the memory of generations. In another classroom, Grace and Mrs. Mercedes supervised a unique exchange. An elderly African-American woman was teaching traditional techniques to a French chef, while he shared preservation methods that would help keep ancient recipes alive. It's beautiful, Grace commented to Mrs. Mercedes. Grandma Rose always said that the kitchen was the place where all languages became one. Sarah, meanwhile, coordinated via video conference with the other international locations. On the screens, you could see the kitchens of Blackwell hotels in different countries, each converted into a center for preserving and evolving culinary traditions. The results of the first month are incredible, Edward reported, showing statistics on his tablet. We've documented more than 1,000 traditional recipes that were at risk of being lost. Indigenous communities are sharing techniques that had never been recorded before. Richard, who now spent his days between classrooms and his office, observed everything with a mixture of pride and amazement. If my father could see this, how what he considered a threat has become our greatest treasure. Alexander entered his father's office excitedly. The confirmation just arrived. UNESCO will not only recognize the Flavor Guardians as cultural heritage, but they'll use our educational model as a global example of preserving culinary traditions. In the garden, Isabel directed a team of documentarians recording the testimonies of the original guardians. Their stories would become part of the school's curriculum, ensuring that future generations would know the struggle that made this moment possible. Every story we document, Isabel explained to the cameras, is a bridge between the past and the future. The recipes are just the beginning. What we're really preserving is the spirit of resistance and love that kept them alive. During a break between classes, Victoria found her father contemplating the mural of the Guardians in the lobby. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" she asked softly. "About how we tried for so long to hide our true wealth," Richard replied. "These women whom we once tried to silence were preserving the real treasure of our family. And look at what they've created," Victoria smiled. "Not just a school, but a worldwide movement." At that moment, a group of excited students rushed by. They had successfully reproduced an ancient recipe that was thought to be lost. "Professor Victoria," called a young Japanese student, "you have to try this. We combined the traditional pot roast technique with Japanese fermentation methods." Victoria tasted the dish, and her eyes filled with tears. It tastes like the future," she whispered, "like living tradition, evolving without losing itself." Grace, who had approached the group, smiled wisely. Grandma Rose always said that recipes are like rivers. They must flow and adapt, but never forget their source. The afternoon sun streamed through the hotel's windows, illuminating the faces of 3 generations united by their love for cooking and its traditions. In every corner of the building, the legacy of the Flavor Guardians not only survived, but flourished in ways that not even they could have imagined. 6 months after the inauguration, the Grand Central Hotel was preparing for a special event, the first graduation of students from the International School of the Flavor Guardians. The old ballroom, now converted into a multi-purpose space, was decorated with historical photographs and traditional aromatic herbs. Victoria, elegant in a suit that combined elements of haute couture with traditional embroidery, supervised the final details when Sarah arrived with exciting news. "You won't believe this," she exclaimed, waving a letter. "The French Culinary Academy wants to establish a permanent exchange program. They say our teaching methods have revolutionized the way culinary traditions are preserved." Grace, who was preparing dishes for the ceremony with her students, smiled upon hearing the news. Grandma Rose always said that good food knows no borders. In the main kitchen, Mrs. Mercedes supervised the preparation of a special menu that represented the fusion of all the cultures present in the school. Each dish told a story of transformation and preservation. "This pot roast," she explained to the students working beside her, "now has a touch of Indian spices, but maintains its traditional essence. Like you, different origins but the same heart of Guardians." Richard, fully recovered, walked through the hotel corridors observing the photographs that documented the transformation of the last few months. He stopped in front of one that showed his wife with the original Guardians. "She always knew," he murmured. "She always knew this was the true destiny of the hotel." Alexander approached his father, carrying more photographs for the exhibition. "And look at this," he said, showing him images of the other international locations. "Every hotel in the chain has become a center of cultural preservation." In the garden, Isabel directed a special photo session. The original Guardians, who were still alive, posed alongside the new generation of students. The image perfectly symbolized the bridge between past and future. Each photograph, Isabel explained to her team, is a testament to how love for our traditions can transform the world. During the graduation ceremony, the students presented their final projects. Each represented a unique fusion of tradition and innovation. Japanese sushi rolls with traditional American fillings, pot roasts that incorporated French techniques, typical desserts reinvented with modern preparation methods. Victoria, giving her speech as the school's director, couldn't contain her emotion. 6 months ago, we discovered that the walls of this hotel held more than secrets. They held dreams. Dreams of women who, in the darkness of their kitchens, kept the flame of our traditions alive. Today, that flame not only burns bright, but has ignited fires in kitchens around the world. Sarah continued, "Each graduate who leaves this school carries with them not only techniques and recipes, but a sacred responsibility to be a guardian of our culinary traditions, adapting them to the future without losing their essence." Grace, watching her students receive their diplomas, thought of her. "Mother, Mom, your legacy didn't just survive, it blossomed beyond our wildest dreams." At the end of the ceremony, all those present participated in a special ritual. Each graduate lit a candle from the main kitchen fire, symbolizing how knowledge and tradition are passed from generation to generation. "The fire that burns in these candles," Mrs. Mercedes declared with an emotional voice, "is the same that burned in secret kitchens for decades. May its light never go out." The night ended with a grand celebration where each graduate presented a dish that represented their personal journey at the school. The Grand Central Hotel, once a symbol of exclusivity and segregation, had transformed into a beacon of inclusion and cultural preservation. Exactly 1 year had passed since that day when Sarah offered a sandwich to a stranger in the park. The Grand Central Hotel, now an international center for culinary preservation, celebrated its first anniversary with a special event that brought together all the people who had made this transformation possible. In the main garden, where everything began with the Guardians Festival, Sarah and Victoria watched the sunset as guests began to arrive. "Can you believe everything that's happened in a year?" Sarah asked, adjusting the apron that once belonged to Grandma Rose. Sometimes it feels like a dream, Victoria replied, who now proudly wore her mother's old apron. But then I hear the laughter in the kitchens, see the students learning, and I know it's more real than ever. Grace approached her daughters, carrying the original recipe book of Grandma Rose, now restored and digitized for future generations. Grandma always said that kindness, like a good sandwich, has the power to transform lives. Richard, fully recovered and transformed by the events of the past year, joined his family. And to think we tried for so long to hide our true wealth, he reflected, looking at the illuminated hotel. These walls held the greatest treasure of all, love for our traditions. The celebration brought together students from all international locations. In every corner of the garden, cooking stations had been set up where different generations of guardians shared their knowledge. Mrs. Mercedes, although older, continued to teach with the same passion as always. True success, she explained to a group of young chefs, isn't in awards or international recognition. It's in every recipe preserved, in every technique passed on, in every story shared. Alexander, who had documented every step of this transformation, presented the complete historical archive. The Flavor Guardians, a story of love and resistance. The document would be distributed to libraries and culinary schools around the world. Isabel, surrounded by her team of documentarians, captured the final moments of this story that had begun with a simple act of kindness. Each image, she explained, is a testament to how love can transform the world. As night fell, the whole family gathered in the center of the garden. Victoria took the floor. A year ago, we discovered that we were more than two families united by secrets and pain. We were heirs to a legacy of love, preserved in every recipe, in every technique, in every story whispered in secret kitchens. Sarah continued, and now that legacy not only lives but flourishes. In every kitchen of our hotels, in every school we've opened, in every student who learns our traditions. Grace, looking at the starry sky, added, Grandma Rose used to say that recipes are like stars. They may seem distant, but their light guides us home. Richard, taking Victoria and Sarah's hands, concluded, and this is our home now. Not just a hotel, not just a school, but a place where all traditions are honored, where all flavors are celebrated. The aroma of traditional dishes mingled with laughter and music, as new generations of guardians continued the legacy of love and preservation that had begun in the secret kitchens of this very hotel. And so at the Grand Central Hotel, where traditions once had to hide, they now flourished in broad daylight, reminding everyone that love, like a good dish, has the power to transform lives, unite hearts, and build bridges between past and future. As the celebration continued into the night, a surprise guest arrived at the hotel. It was none other than the President of the United States, who had heard about the remarkable transformation of the Grand Central Hotel and its impact on preserving American culinary heritage. I had to see this for myself, the President said, addressing the gathered crowd. What you've accomplished here is nothing short of extraordinary. You've not only preserved our nation's culinary traditions, but have also created a model for cultural understanding and unity. The President's visit brought national attention to the Flavor Guardians project, sparking a nationwide interest in preserving local culinary traditions. In the weeks that followed, similar initiatives began to sprout up across the country, from small-town diners to prestigious restaurants in major cities. Sarah, Victoria, and Alexander found themselves increasingly in demand, invited to speak at conferences, culinary schools, and even international forums on cultural preservation. Their story became an inspiration for people around the world looking to reconnect with their roots through food. One evening, as the family gathered in the hotel's rooftop garden for a quiet dinner, Grace brought out an old, weathered notebook. I found this in the attic of our old house, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's Grandma Rose's personal diary. I think it's time we read it together. As Grace began to read, the family was transported back in time to the days when Rose was just beginning her journey as a guardian of flavors. April 15, 1950. Today, I made a decision that will change my life forever. I will no longer stand by and watch as our precious culinary heritage fades away. Elizabeth Blackwell and I have formed a pact. We will become the guardians of our traditions, the keepers of our flavors. It won't be easy. We'll face resistance, ridicule, and perhaps even danger. But the alternative, losing the very essence of who we are, is unthinkable. We've recruited other women from all walks of life, society ladies who've never set foot in a kitchen, immigrant cooks with recipes passed down through generations, African-American women with a culinary wisdom that puts French chefs to shame. Together, we will preserve not just recipes, but a way of life. To my future granddaughter, who I hope will read this someday, never forget where you come from. The kitchen is not just a place to prepare food. It's where families are nourished, where cultures blend, where love is expressed in its purest form. Be brave, be kind, and always, always cook with your heart. As Grace finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the group. The words of Grandma Rose, spoken across decades, resonated deeply with each of them. She knew, Sarah whispered. Somehow she knew that we would be here continuing her work. Victoria nodded, wiping away a tear. And look at what her vision has become. It's grown beyond anything she could have imagined. Richard, who had been listening intently, spoke up. I think it's time we took this to the next level. We've preserved the past and connected it to the present. Now let's use it to shape the future. What do you have in mind, Dad? Alexander asked, intrigued. A global initiative, Richard replied, his eyes shining with excitement. We'll call it Flavors Without Borders. We'll use our network of hotels and schools to create cultural exchange programs, focusing on traditional cuisines from around the world. The idea was met with enthusiastic approval from everyone. Over the next few hours, they brainstormed and planned, their excitement growing with each new idea. They envisioned culinary students from America, traveling to remote villages in China to learn ancient cooking techniques, and in return, Chinese cooks coming to the heartland of America to master the art of barbecue. They imagined Italian grandmothers teaching their pasta-making secrets to young chefs from Brazil, while Brazilian cooks shared the intricacies of their vibrant tropical cuisine. But it's not just about the exchange of recipes and techniques, Sarah pointed out. It's about creating understanding between cultures. Food has always been a universal language. We're just helping to amplify its voice. As the night wore on, their plans became more ambitious. They talked about partnering with governments and international organizations to use culinary traditions as a tool for diplomacy and conflict resolution. They discussed creating a global database of endangered recipes and cooking techniques, ensuring that no culinary tradition would ever be lost to time. We'll need to expand our team, Alexander said, making notes on his tablet. We'll need anthropologists, historians, nutritionists, even diplomats. And we'll need to ensure that the communities we work with benefit directly from this initiative, Victoria added. This isn't about exploitation or commercialization. It's about preservation, education, and empowerment. As dawn broke over the New York skyline, the family realized they had been up all night, fueled by their passion and excitement for this new chapter in their journey. Grace, looking at her daughters, son-in-law and grandson, felt a surge of pride. Rose would be so proud, she said softly. Not just of what we've accomplished, but of who we've become. In the weeks and months that followed, the Flavors Without Borders initiative took shape. The Blackwell-Thompson family worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life, facing challenges and setbacks but never losing sight of their goal. They partnered with UNESCO to create a global registry of culinary heritage, ensuring that traditional recipes and techniques from even the most remote corners of the world were documented and preserved. They established scholarships for young chefs from underprivileged backgrounds, giving them the opportunity to study at the Grand Central Hotel School and then return to their communities as culinary ambassadors. They worked with governments to incorporate traditional cooking classes into school curricula, ensuring that future generations would grow up with an appreciation for their culinary heritage. The Grand Central Hotel became a hub of international culinary diplomacy. World leaders would meet over meals prepared by chefs from conflict zones, finding common ground in their shared appreciation for good food. 1 year after the launch of Flavors Without Borders, the family gathered once again in the rooftop garden of the Grand Central Hotel. The city stretched out below them, a glittering tapestry of lights, but their attention was focused on a simple meal laid out before them. On the table was a feast that told the story of their journey. Sarah's sandwiches, made with the recipe that had started it all. Victoria's pot roast, perfected under Mrs. Mercedes' tutelage. Traditional dishes from every corner of the globe, each with its own story of preservation and rediscovery. As they sat down to eat, Sarah raised her glass in a toast. To Grandma Rose and all the flavor guardians who came before us. To the power of food to unite, to heal, to preserve our shared humanity. And to all of you, my family, for believing in this dream and making it a reality. As they clinked glasses, each of them felt the weight of their accomplishments, but also the excitement of the journey still ahead. They had transformed not just a hotel, not just a family, but had sparked a global movement that was changing the way people thought about food, culture, and heritage. And somewhere they knew, Grandma Rose was smiling down on them, her legacy alive and thriving in ways she could never have imagined. As the family enjoyed their meal, sharing stories and laughter, they couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. From a simple act of kindness, a sandwich shared with a stranger, had grown a movement that was changing lives around the world. Victoria, looking at her mother Grace, suddenly had an idea. "Mom," she said, "I think it's time we wrote our own book. Not just a recipe book, but a story of our journey, of how a family secret became a global mission." Grace's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's a wonderful idea. We could include not just recipes, but the stories behind them. The struggles, the triumphs, the moments of discovery. And we could invite other flavor guardians from around the world to contribute," Sarah added excitedly. "It could be a collective memoir of this incredible movement." Alexander, always thinking about the bigger picture, chimed in. "We could turn it into a series, each volume focusing on a different region or culinary tradition. It could become a comprehensive chronicle of global culinary heritage." As they discussed the book project, Richard sat back and listened, a contented smile on his face. He marveled at how his family had transformed what was once a source of shame and secrecy into something beautiful and world-changing. "You know," he said when there was a lull in the conversation, "I've been thinking about my father, and about Frank Thompson, about the choices they made, and the consequences of those choices." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Richard. "For so long, I was angry at my father for his deception, for the pain he caused. But now I can't help but think, what if he had made different choices? What if instead of betraying Frank, he had embraced his vision? Imagine what they could have accomplished together." Victoria reached out and squeezed her father's hand. "It's not too late, Dad. In a way, we're fulfilling both their legacies. The Blackwell business acumen and the Thompson creative vision working in harmony." Richard nodded, his eyes misting over. "You're right. And that's why I've made a decision." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to establish a foundation in both their names. The Blackwell-Thompson Foundation for Culinary Heritage. It will ensure that the work we're doing continues for generations to come, regardless of what happens to the hotel business." The announcement was met with enthusiastic approval from the family. They spent the next hour discussing the possibilities this new foundation could open up. Expanded scholarship programs, research grants for food historians, funding for community kitchens in underserved areas, and much more. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah stood up and walked to the edge of the rooftop garden. The city lights twinkled below, a reminder of how far they had come and how many lives they had touched. She motioned for the others to join her. "Look at this city," she said softly. "In every neighborhood, every home, there's a story told through food. We've started something beautiful here, but our work is far from over." Victoria nodded, putting an arm around her sister. "We've honored the past, but now we're shaping the future. Every meal cooked, every recipe shared, every cultural bridge built, it's all part of a greater legacy." Alexander raised his glass. "To the flavor guardians, past, present, and future. May we always remember that the greatest revolutions start in the kitchen." As they toasted, Grace felt a sense of completion. The secret her mother had entrusted to her had blossomed into something far greater than she could have imagined. The legacy of Rose, of Frank, of all those who had cooked and preserved and loved in secret, was now a beacon for the world. Richard, looking at his family, not just those related by blood, but all those who had become part of this grand adventure, felt a profound sense of peace. The mistakes of the past had been transformed into opportunities for the future, In the years that followed, the Blackwell-Thompson Foundation became a global force for culinary preservation and cultural understanding. The Grand Central Hotel, once a symbol of exclusivity, became a pilgrimage site for food lovers and culture enthusiasts from around the world. But more importantly, in kitchens across America and beyond, people were rediscovering the joy of cooking, the importance of preserving their heritage, and the power of food to bring people together. And it all started with a simple act of kindness, a sandwich shared between strangers on a New York morning. As the family made their way back inside, the aroma of their shared meal lingering in the air, they knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The story of the Flavor Guardians would continue, with each meal cooked, each recipe shared, each new generation that discovered the power of food to connect, heal, and inspire. In the grand kitchen of the hotel, a new batch of students was already preparing for the next day's lessons, their excited chatter floating up to the rooftop. The legacy lived on, a continuous feast of flavors, stories, and love.